Welcome to the Sourcing Hero podcast, produced by Una, a group purchasing organization that empowers sourcing heroes, and Art of Procurement, the world's largest procurement podcast network. I'm your host, Kelly Barner. The goal of the Sourcing Hero podcast is to capture the epic stories of people who are rising up and beating the odds to create exceptional value within procurement, directly from those heroes themselves. Today, my guest here on the Sourcing Hero podcast is Alexis Normand. Alexis is the CEO and co-founder at Greenly. Now, given his expertise in carbon accounting and management, he is an ideal guest to speak with about some of the practical business challenges facing procurement and supply chain professionals who are tasked with responsibility for their company's ESG or sustainability programs. So, hi, Alexis. Thank you so much for being with me today.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. Now, I've already set the stage in terms of what your expertise is and where you work. But before we get into the conversation, would you mind sharing just a little bit more about your professional journey so people can get to know you better?
Sure. Before I started this company in climate tech, I was actually in a very different topic, working in Boston at a company called Withings, which makes IoT for digital health. And I was working mainly with health systems, supplying IoT devices to track health metrics around weight or activity to prevent diabetes or chronic heart failure. And I guess the link to climate, of course, is we had built economic incentives for people to change behavior and live healthier lives. And when we started out Greenly, the idea was to do the same, but around carbon footprint. How do you nudge people today to improve their carbon footprint, do their part for the environment? Well, just like in healthcare, it's all about tracking and improving your metrics and having short-term rewards for essentially things that bring long-term benefits. So that's the very short story of how I essentially pivoted from digital health to climate tech.
And it's quite a pivot. Now, it's interesting that you talk about short-term changes and long-term rewards, because especially once we consider the sustainability movement from the perspective of procurement and supply chain professionals, that's very much what we're trying to achieve on a daily basis. And given that that's where the majority of this audience is focused, we're going to talk about Scope 3 emissions today. But before we really get into the topic, I would love to just have you give a quick rundown on what Scope 3 emissions means for anybody that's not familiar with the terminology.
Yes, of course. So when a company decides to disclose its carbon footprint, right, which includes CO2 but other emissive, gases, essentially there is a standard which is called the GHG protocol, which defines a set of categories for companies to report their emissions. So the first category is Scope 1, which is essentially all the fossil fuels that you burn within your own premises or with the machines that you own. So it's the gas that you burn with company-owned cars. It's the gas that you use to heat your building. It's the gases that are used for your air conditioning and so on. That's Scope 1. And if you have a lot of machines and you're burning a lot of fuel, you have a lot of that. But for services company, you have very little. Now you have so-called Scope 2, which is all the emissions linked to your energy consumption outside your premises. So if you are essentially getting a lot of electricity or heating from a utility, so the actual emissions are with that utility somewhere else, and they come, and basically the energy comes to you through the grid, but you're still kind of responsible for it because you're consuming all that energy. That's Scope 2. And to your question, Scope 3 is basically everything else that as a result of your economic activity leads to GHG emissions. So let's break it down. Typically, the biggest category is Scope 3.1, which is all the emissions linked to your supply chain. So say you're a manufacturing company, you're buying a lot of raw materials, maybe you're buying a lot of aluminum, right? So to get that aluminum to you, a lot of energy has been spent. So there are actually emissions linked to that raw material. And so it's very indirect for you as a company, but you do have to account for it as part of your scope 3. So all the raw material, all the products and purchases that you buy. It may also include things like, so that's very relevant to, of course, people working in supply chain. But you have other categories, so such as logistics and freight, all the transportation of these goods, what you buy, but also what you sell if you ship to people. You actually also have the commute of your employees and their business travel. If you're a consultancy and everybody flies all the time, east and west coast, well, the emissions are with the airplanes, right? But they're still a result of you flying around people.
Mm.
And then maybe, I mean, it's quite detailed, but just a last category of scope 3, which is often overlooked, is the usage of your product. So, say you're a car manufacturer and you need to put gas in those cars. Well, say your General Motor, well, basically all the people that buy your car, they're going to put a lot of fuel throughout your product's life, and so that has a lot of emissions. And for cars, basically, it's like 80% of their emissions, and as a result, for car companies as well. So anyway, that's a very quick overview, but I would just conclude saying in all those categories, supply chain tends to be the biggest category. So scope 3 is typically more than 80% of a company's emission. And as part of this, the largest single category tends to be your supply chain. So essentially all that you buy and sell.
Now, when we think about, given all of those different types of energy consumption and environmental impact that you talked about, and we connect it back to this idea of short term change, long term impact, I'm interested about where some of the specific incentives come into this. So, for instance, what are some of the most common reasons that companies track their carbon emissions?
A great question. So there are, I guess, three main sets of reasons. The first reason is, of course, compliance. There are a number of countries where this is an obligation. In Europe, for instance, it would be if you have more than 500 employees, right? And now there's a new regulation coming in, which is called the CSRD, so a Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. It says any company that has more than 250 employees or is doing more than $40 million euro of business in Europe will have to report its scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And that includes US companies, maybe about 5,000 US companies doing business in Europe. So compliance is one, and that is set to increase. You probably have seen that the governor of California has signed a bill into law, SB 253, which says any business doing more than $1 billion in the state of California, and that's about 5,000 companies, will need to report its emissions. So for larger companies, that's the main reason. But now you have actually a trickle down effect of this, because what most of these regulations are saying is you need to track your full set of emissions, including your scope 3, which means you have to essentially make assumptions about the emissions of your supply chain. And no one likes to guess. People like to measure things
Yeah.
precisely. So you have to start tracking basically the emissions of your suppliers at one point. And this results into a lot of procurement departments starting to ask their top suppliers what their own emissions are so that they can compute their scope 3. And so we see a lot of that, and specifically at Greenly, we see a lot of mid-market companies, even SMBs, starting to track their footprint. We typically work with a lot of Walmart supplier who have made this, basically a prerequisite if you want to
Mm.
work with them. The U.S. Army has introduced this as a condition to some of its contracts. I think if it's above $50 million a year or something, you have to report your emissions. So essentially, you're seeing a lot of companies who don't want to be locked out of procurement, right? Starting to track their own emissions. And for the small and mid-market companies, I would say that's actually the main reason, because they don't necessarily have to comply with anything right now.
Now, with my procurement ears, anytime I hear about different factors that will influence decision making, I start to think, is this going to make my purchases more expensive? So, if we start, whether it's driven by regulations, compliance concerns, a very large customer requires it. In your experience, does building or investing in building a more sustainable supply chain ultimately add cost?
No, it's a great question, because fundamentally, that's, the very challenge we have with the energy transition. If basically it costs less to be greener, everybody would do it, right? So, but I think there are two levels to the answer I can give you. First level is, it doesn't necessarily cost a lot to report your emissions. We're in most companies, most procurement departments are still at the point where they're baselining, right? So they're trying to figure out, if they have to make reductions, where that should happen. So basically, you can baseline your own emissions at a just making assumptions on your whole supply chain with essentially a kind of spend-based approach through software, and that's relatively cost-effective. But it doesn't mean it changes your practice. You can ask your suppliers to do it, and for them, you have solutions out there where the reporting is actually much cheaper than, say, financial reporting, right? But now, to the real point, once you figured out which are your top spend categories, your top emissive categories, and you have to essentially, replace. You have to show not just good accounting, but you have to show real progression. That's when things start to heat up somewhat. And here, well, it's this notion of green premium. What's the cost of switching from one type of purchase to another? There are areas where it's cheaper to emit less, right? You see this in fuel consumption, and you see this in electricity consumption. If you manage to reduce, the emissions linked to electricity, it's usually because you've shifted from using coal or
Mm.
gasoline or something to using renewables, and actually the economics for renewals now are better in many cases than the economics for fossil fuels. So you're saving money on your scope two. You're saving money reducing, the heating of your buildings, isolating them, and so on. But but it becomes much trickier when you have to choose between two raw materials. Should I buy this aluminium or that aluminium? And here the cost element is due to the fact that maybe you're buying some of your raw material out of China, where notoriously the emissions are linked to how carbon intensive the Chinese grid is, and it's mostly coal, basically. And so if you buy aluminium from China, it may be much cheaper, but it's also much more emissive. And now, if you buy it from, say, Sweden, where the electricity is very hydroelectric or very solar intensive, then it's actually much less emissive, but it's also more expensive. So that's the thing. And you've seen companies like Apple introduce criteria where where even Walmart does it. They force their suppliers to switch to green energy, so that they can essentially pay the same price but have lower emission products, if you see what I mean.
Now, one of the things I find particularly interesting about this whole movement is some of the larger context things that have going on, especially over the last few years. I mean, the idea of sustainability or green sourcing is not new, right? Supplier diversity is not new. In fact, you mentioned General Motors. I mean, they were doing some of these things in the 1960s. So maybe under the label of CSR or corporate social responsibility, some of these ideas have been around for a long time. But more recently, we've sort of created this new umbrella, because we love our acronyms, of ESG. So we have environmental, social, and governance based initiatives. When I talk to companies, especially in the US, a lot of times I'll ask about, how do you feel the rise of ESG as an overarching movement has impacted something more specific like supplier diversity. And so I'm curious to know from you sort of the same thing around emissions and sustainability. Do you think this broader ESG movement is helping or hurting targeted sustainability initiatives?
Uh, uh, Very interesting question because ESG, if you think about it, is fairly recent. I mean, I guess it's been growing consistently over the last 20 years, and now it's reached a point where essentially every say, large or somewhat large company is doing it, and you start to, and of course you can't criticize the underlying idea that you need to have good governance, be fair to your employees, or respect the environment. But the thing is, it's become an object where there are so many criteria that having a very good ESG score doesn't tell you all that much about
Mm,
what a company is doing, because a lot of companies are essentially choosing how they weight their scoring. So, I mean, I guess the paroxysm of that is when you have companies like ExxonMobil who have a very good ESG score because they're probably doing very well on governance and social and so on. But obviously, they don't have such a good environmental
mm,
score because they're pumping so much GHG into the atmosphere, right? And so I think I can't really criticize ESG in itself, but as a person focused essentially on carbon, I would say the emissions part of ESG is totally diluted into the other criteria. And now what you're seeing is people are realizing that maybe fighting climate change is actually the priority, and they can't really use ESG ratings as a reliable
uh,
way to assess whether a company is or is not on track, to reducing its emissions. So I think I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater here, but I would say you need to single out the emissions there,
mm,
and it's been shown by research, basically, looking at Moody's indicator, S&P indicators, EcoVadis indicators, that there is essentially no correlation between having a super high ESG grade and being on track to decarbonize. So I believe that actually decarbonization is the priority, and that you need to have carbon only ratings. And what these ratings need to reflect is not just how good a company is at disclosing its emissions, but how it is doing at reducing them year over year. Has it formalized a strategy? Is it clear how it's going to change its procurement to
mm,
factor in emissions? Is it actually introducing action plans? Is it actually reducing? Is it offsetting part of its emissions? And so on and so forth. So that's my take on ESG. I don't want ESG to be political. I want carbon to be a technical topic that people work on so that we reduce our emissions globally.
Now, one of the things that you just mentioned, I actually want to go back to and ask a quick follow up because I feel like this is something we should call out. A lot of us, even in procurement and supply chain, are getting our initial education around emissions, around sustainability as consumers. We're actually hearing what companies are projecting to us as individual buyers as opposed to as corporate buyers. And so we hear a lot about carbon emissions offsets. So a company might say, sure, maybe we're not the most efficient, or maybe our executives are constantly flying around in private jets, but look, we've planted trees. Do you have an opinion on the relative merit or effort required to offset emissions versus changing an operation in order to reduce them?
Yeah, actually, I have very strong opinions on this. So essentially, offsets in themselves are not a bad thing, but the problem with that is today there are only about 1% of emissions that are available for offsets. So if everybody were to offset, you just wouldn't find enough good projects. And so if the only strategy that you have regarding climate change is to offset, you're not really helping fix the problem, because I mean, you might be by financing more offsets, but you would have to plant trees in the there's just not enough land, basically, for this to be a fully scalable solution. So the only problem I have with offsets is if it essentially somehow absolves a company from not trying to reduce their emissions. And to make matters worse, I think a lot of offsets have been actually kind of fake. There was a scandal last year because what you buy essentially is there are two types of offsets. There are offsets that are avoided emissions, and there are offsets that are long-term capture. And a lot of the offsets that were purchased were essentially avoided emissions. So you're paying to protect a forest from getting
Oh,
cut or being burnt down, but you are paying for a projection of the avoided emissions of that forest not being cut down. And part of the scandal was that the assumptions for avoided emissions were widely optimistic. So you're buying a piece of paper that didn't have any tangible value, basically. And so I think it has become a bit of a liability to do this, because not
mm,
only are you paying a lot, but then you get called out on greenwashing because you
yes.
actually finance something that had no effect. So I think it's essentially a safer strategy to first focus on reducing your emissions, and then of course trying to find offsets, but just making sure they're high quality and they're not on the avoidance side, but rather on the actual capture. And that's much harder to do. So you can plant trees, but you can do other things to capture emissions.
Now, Alexi, we have a tradition here on the Sourcing Hero podcast. And so as we start to wind down our time, I want to give you an opportunity to participate in that. I'm going to give you two questions. You can pick either one, and there are no wrong answers. So your choices are: what does the idea of a sourcing hero mean to you? Or what do you think heroism looks like in a business context?
Well, I'll try and answer the first one maybe. What's a sourcing hero? So I think managing supply chains has been very hard in recent years with all the COVID supply chain related problems and so on. But so a lot of supply chain or procurement managers have been focused essentially on just making sure supply chains work. But now, why would it be heroic? Well, essentially, you now have to add this extra variable, which is what I'm buying. Is it helping me progress on a reduction strategy, or is it not? And so I can give you I can paint a picture of what that hero looks like, because we've met a lot of them. It's basically somebody taking the lead to say, well, now we're going to add this new strategy, and here's how we're going to do it. A lot of companies, they'll start by signing up on a pledge to reduce their emissions. The most famous standard right now is something called the Science-Based Target Initiatives, SBTI. And when you sign this, there are about 5,000 companies that have signed it. You essentially pledge to engage 60% of your suppliers on your own reduction strategy.
Mhm.
That trajectory is defined according to your sector. So it's typically 5-6% reduction a year. And if you're in oil, it's 10. And if you're in food, maybe it's 3 or something. And so you have to start implementing actual tools where you can reach out to your suppliers. You ask them to report. You collect data from their products, from their organization. You track progress year over year, and you do this out of your own initiative. You do get rewarded actually with medals and recognitions and awards and so on this. It's built in those solutions, but you have to balance this with actually what we usually expect of procurement managers is to just make sure products come in, and also keeping costs down. And so I think that's this very difficult equation that people need to solve. And I think what's heroic is starting it and making it basically a process that people will carry out on and again, make it normal, basically.
Well, I appreciate what you've shared. Certainly there's been a lot of education in what we've talked about, but I think what I more appreciate is that you've shared your perspective. Certainly your passion comes across. I think it brings life to the complexity that exists around this issue for people and companies that actually want to drive change versus looking like they're making motions to drive change. Alexi, if people are just meeting you through this conversation, what is the best way for them to connect with you or to learn more?
No, that's great. So it's super easy. I mean, people can actually write me an email, Alexis, Alexis, at Greenly, Greenly, .earth, or just LinkedIn me. I'm very accessible and always excited to actually, translate all I've said into practice. We do this all day long and we love it. And we love it when we get people on board.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sourcing Hero podcast. Join us again next time for more true stories of sourcing and business heroism performed by your colleagues and peers. Look for the Sourcing Hero wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe. Finally, don't forget, sourcing heroism is taking place all around us every day. Keep your eyes open and you're bound to see it. Until next time, I'm your host, Kelly Barner. Stay well and always remember that you can be a hero too.